All right, Bill Browder is the founder of Hermitage Capital, and he's also well known for, trying to get sanctions against the President Putin's regime in Russia for years now. Hi, Bill. Welcome.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again. So, look, the debate on frozen Russian assets. I mean, I want to take you down that road, but just for people who don't understand what's happened, the war started and 300 roughly $1 billion in Russian assets were frozen in US and mostly European banks. Am I correct?
Exactly. So about a week after the war started, the main countries allied with Ukraine against Russia, the United States, Canada, the European Union, UK, Japan, Australia, all of those countries in unison froze what appears to be about $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. This is the money that the Russian government kept in foreign currency. And that money has been frozen since the beginning of the war. And the original intention was just to unfreeze it at the end of the war, and that would be part of the negotiation when there was a peace settlement. But of course, the war has gone on a lot longer than people had hoped. Russia has destroyed, depending on whose estimates you believe, somewhere between 500 billion and $1 trillion of property in Ukraine. And the obvious thing that brings you to is that money shouldn't just be frozen at this point. That money should be confiscated and given to Ukraine. And that's where the debate is at the moment: is should it be confiscated or should it not? And if it is confiscated, how do you do it? And then lots of people on both sides of the debate trying to come up with their own reasonings why it shouldn't be done.
All right, let's walk through some of that. So the European Central Bank argues against seizing frozen assets, which almost seems like a contradiction in term to me, because they are in effect seized. Russia certainly couldn't go and make a bank withdrawal at this point, but they are not redirected to anything. So they're frozen in these banks. And Washington now, I think that it seemed to me that initially America was kind of behind everybody else in this debate. And the last ones that wanted to deal with the whole issue of assets, now they seem to be leading the charge. I mean, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is talking to the Europeans and saying that, that we have to take some of these Russian assets, and Russia has to pay at this point. How we take them and what form we take them, but it looks like the U.S. now is leading that charge. Is that right?
Well, in all of these stories, the U.S. is usually the one leading the charge, and the Europeans are the ones lagging. And this is another example of the whole story. I mean, there's very little that anyone can say in favor of Putin here. Ukraine didn't ask for this war. Putin launched the war. Ukraine has and suffered enormous damage. Putin caused that damage. We have custody of the money, of Russian money, and there's really nobody who could make the argument that Russia doesn't owe Ukraine this money. What happens as you sort of get into the details is you have different people from sort of different parts of the apparatus of government and central banks, starting to squirm and say, well, actually, this hasn't been done before.
Right.
If it kind of makes sense on the surface, with
This is where you get into this idea that the seizure would threaten the future stability of the financial system, because countries like China and Gulf states would then potentially, the argument against this, they would then shun Western reserve currency.
Which is an absurd argument, because there's no such thing as a Western reserve currency. There is something called a reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that belongs to a country that's liquid, which means you can convert into it and convert out of it without any problem, where the economic sort of background of that country is relatively stable. They don't have hyperinflation or other types of things. And as a result, there are only certain countries that have reserve currencies. The United States has a reserve currency. The EU has a reserve currency. Japan has a reserve currency. Switzerland has one. UK has one. These are the reserve currencies, and there are no other currencies that are reserve currencies. If somebody else comes up with a reserve currency, probably they would be part of our alliance against Russia and for Ukraine. It's generally the sort of safe, civilized countries that are reserve currencies, and so, it's an absurd and specious argument to say that the Saudis, for example, would keep their money in Argentine pesos or Brazilian real. It's a dumb argument. It just doesn't make any sense. The only thing they can do is keep their money in reserve currencies. We have the reserve currencies, and so as much as people may not like the idea that if you launch a war of aggression, you can have your money confiscated, nobody has any other options. And so I don't know why people are making this argument. I've been in the world of finance my entire life. I'm 60 years old. I've been doing this for nearly 40 years. There's no other place for them to keep their money. I can guarantee you that. And so that's just a stupid, dumb argument that shouldn't be made because it makes no sense.
All right. No, nobody's arguing for the pesos, but in terms of the euro and the dollar, those who don't want to go along with this, and it looks like it's a lot of Europe, are saying maybe there's a compromise. Why don't we take the interest from the frozen Russian assets and give that to Ukraine in the form of what, a loan or a bond?
Well, so again, let's back up on this whole thing. So what's happening is the European Union doesn't have a single decision maker. There's not like the president of the European Union who's weighing up the costs and benefits of this thing. The European Union is basically a sort of administrative construct in which there are 27 countries that have to come to a consensus decision. And so the consensus decision is based on some countries that are bullish on Ukraine and defending freedom, and then there are some countries that are friendly with Putin, like Hungary. And so what ends up happening is they come to basically sort of a fudge, a compromise, a complete. It's not a decision made up of pros and cons and all that kind of stuff.
Is that why? Is it because Slovakia and Hungary and those countries, they won't give them a unanimous decision, therefore let's come up with this fudge? Is that really the reason why?
That's how it works. I've been involved in advocacy, sanctions advocacy at the European Union for the last decade. I know exactly how it works, and that's how it works. And so it's not like someone saying this is the best alternative given all the pros and cons. This is a bunch of people negotiating with themselves and coming to some lowest common denominator. And before we get to is it the right decision or the wrong decision, let me just address the other big concern that people have about confiscating the money, which is they're saying it's not legal. There's no law that allows you to do this. And again, I want to stress that of course it's legal. If a country invades another country and causes damages, they've broken the law. They've broken international law, and they've got to pay for those damages. And there has been absolute legal precedent of that happening. That happened after the first Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. We confiscated their central bank reserves. It happened when at the end of the Second World War, Nazi Germany, we confiscated a huge amount of their sovereign property.
They were cases of direct conflict, were they not? Whereas Ukraine is.
There's a direct conflict between Ukraine,
because it's not a war within. I mean, it is part of Europe, but it's not a war within Western Europe where the banks are.
Well, it's a direct conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and so Ukraine has the right to that money, and so then the question is, do they have the derivative right to that money if it's being held somewhere else? And this is where there is potential legal ambiguity. There's no uncertainty about whether they should or shouldn't. It's just legal ambiguity. And so what do you do in a situation where there's legal ambiguity? You create a law to resolve that legal ambiguity. That's exactly what the United States did. They passed something called the Repo Act. This was passed alongside the $61 billion of military aid. And the Repo Act resolves any legal ambiguity. The United States now has the legal right under the Repo Act to confiscate Russian central bank reserves. The same thing can happen here in the UK. It could happen in Europe. They could legislate to say that if a country invades another country and causes damage, then that country's assets in third countries can be confiscated. They can legislate that. That's what lawmakers do, and that would then resolve any legal ambiguity. So, but now you've got this like half-hearted, half-assed decision of the European Union where they're saying, well, we don't believe we can confiscate the principal, but we somehow believe that it's okay to confiscate the interest, which just
would that do anything if that is the end of the discussion and they say instead of 300 billion, we'll give them 30 billion in interest. And I know that's a soft figure because I've read other figures on what the interest would be. Will that do it? Will that accomplish the goal of helping Ukraine at such a desperate time?
Well, 30 billion is greater than zero if that's the number. I don't think that's the number. I think that it's 5% on 200 billion or something like that. But in any event, maybe 4%. I don't know what they earn on these deposits. But what I can say is that if there's a concern about confiscating principal, there should be an equal concern about confiscating interest. That doesn't solve that legal ambiguity. You need to actually legislate for it. And once you've legislated for it, you might as well confiscate the whole damn thing. And at the end of the day, this is not going to be a question of the stability of the financial markets, because that's a complete red herring. And it's not going to be a question of legal ambiguity, because that can be resolved very easily. It's going to purely be a financial question. And the financial question is, should the taxpayers of Europe, should the taxpayers of the UK, should the taxpayers of the United States, should their financial resources, their money, their taxes, be lower on the totem pole, on the pecking order, than Putin's rights to his money? And I would argue that Putin has less of a right to his money than the taxpayers of Europe and the UK and the US and other places to their money. And so we should be taking Putin's money before we take our own money. I think we're going to have to take both in order to carry on with this thing. And
I think by the way, I think the 30 billion figure comes from if you did a loan or a bond over some period of time, they would give them 30, and then that loan would be guaranteed by those Russian assets over time. That's where that number came from.
But that again, that's an absurdity. If we're feeling uncomfortable about confiscating those assets, why should anyone feel comfortable about buying a bond that's secured against those assets if you can't confiscate them if the bond isn't paid? And so it all comes back to the necessity of just confiscating the money once and for all. And I think that it's certainly good to get more money to Ukraine than less. But at the end of the day, this war is going on longer than anyone wanted. There's a huge uncertainty about what's going to happen in November in the US presidential election. If Trump becomes the next president, which looks more likely than not based on the current poll numbers, he's pretty much made it clear he doesn't want to spend any more money on Ukraine, which means that the Europeans will have to double down in order to keep the same amount of aid flowing. And the Europeans probably don't want to double down and tax their taxpayers. And so how do you solve this problem? Well, there's 200 billion sitting at Euroclear in Belgium, and that could go a long way towards funding Ukraine and funding their defense and whatever else they need.
Let me read two quotes to you. I'd be interested in your comments on them. One is from Olena Halushka, head of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, also warns that if the assets are withheld from Ukraine and the country loses the war, the economic and security consequences for Europe would be far worse than reputational risks of using Russian assets.
Well, first of all, I don't think there are any reputational risks. And she's absolutely right that that we're talking about. If Russia wins, then they're going to be fighting at the Estonian border and the Lithuanian border and the Polish border, or even pushing into those countries. And then we have a NATO obligation to fight with Russia, and that's going to be literally. At the moment, the U.S. spends 5% of their military budget supporting Ukraine. The United States will be having to spend the 100% of their military budget fighting Russia. And so she's absolutely right in that respect, which is we should just be doing whatever we can right now to get Ukraine back on track. because otherwise we're going to be the ones engaged in this war.
One more, the Institute for Strategic Studies argues, we quote, "We have this very strange ordering of risks. Somehow we've persuaded ourselves that it's more risky to take Russian state money than it is to send weapons to Ukraine that kill Russian soldiers. That ordering makes no sense."
That I agree with that as well. There is no risk to taking this money, but by the way, there's one other unexpected consequence, which I actually define as an expected consequence, which is that who's the other country that has a whole lot of central bank reserves scattered about the world that's looking at eyeing up invading one of their neighbors, and that's China, and perhaps that will change the economic equation for China. To do the same thing if they see that the world is serious, that if you invade neighbors, you lose your central bank reserves. That would be a good consequence.
Bill, you're always generous with your time, and I thank you. Last question, I promise, and that would be: look, I have friends that go in and out of Russia still, and they tell me, everything's there. Whatever you want on the shelves is still there, despite all these talk of sanctions. And yes, there's been some impact on, Gazprom's profits and et cetera. But generally, goods are flowing, however they get in there, through Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or wherever they're coming from. And Janet Yellen, again, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is saying that these sanctions have to be tightened. They have to work. And, but despite that, the goods seem to flow, and Putin just seems to thumb his nose at the world. Why? Why is it still happening like that?
Well, first of all, what they have on the shelves is not going to determine whether the war stops or starts or ends or begins.
Okay.
What will determine whether this war can carry on is whether Russia can afford the war. And at the moment, we've sanctioned Russia pretty brutally. If you look at this, we're talking about the central bank reserves, which we've frozen. Oligarch reserves have been frozen. We've cut off all Russian companies and government agencies and the government itself from the international capital markets. Companies have fled. 1 million young, able-bodied men have fled. It's a mess over there. And anyone who says it's not is just, repeating Putin's spin, which is that sanctions don't work. But there is one huge loophole in this whole thing, which is that Russia produces a lot of oil. They supply 10% of the world's oil. And because they supply 10% of the world's oil and we're afraid of oil prices going up, we're not embargoing Russian oil. And as a result, they make a couple $100 billion a year off the sale of oil. And they use that money to buy weapons to kill Ukrainians. And until we somehow figure out how to increase oil production elsewhere so that we can embargo Russian oil, they're going to always have enough money to do this. Or if for some reason the oil price were to collapse, maybe that would stop them as well. And so that's the problem, and that's the $200 billion question, which is how do you stop them from getting that $200 billion to buy weapons to kill Ukrainians, because they're basically getting the money indirectly from us, and then we're having to pay the Ukrainians money to fight them back. It would be better if they just didn't have the money to fight in the first place.
Bill Browder, always great to see you. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you.